We are here to talk to you about Luma Infinata. Before we go into that too far, I want to speak with you honestly. I didn't expect to be up here speaking today. When I first met Brian and Carly, my intent was to be here as a volunteer. And when they explained what the basis of TEDx was, illumination, then I started dreaming and a little bit of scheming, thinking about the people that I could get involved with this, people that would be excellent for this sort of background, for this sort of talk. And Chris came to mind in his video, 2:17 a.m., which you can find on the webs. And that's what kind of made us the initial connection. Before we go too far into that, I want Chris to come up and talk about his music and what that means to him.
Thank you. So, my name is Chris Hahn, and I'm a digital artist and musician, and, well, I'm a little bit of a nerd. But actually, I'm a really big nerd. Ever since I was a kid, I've always been really interested in technology and music. One of the first things I did as a kid was my parents had a Commodore 64 computer. And does anybody remember floppy disks at all? I'm not talking about the little 3-inch ones. I'm talking about the actual floppy disks. Well, my parents had this Commodore 64, and I would take their productivity disks, and I would cut a little notch out of the side and flip them over upside down and hide games on the back. So, Mom and Dad, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. So that was like one of my first forays into technology. And another thing I did is I discovered my parents had a couple of these Radio Shack tape recorders. And what I would do is I would put a tape into each one of them, and I would hit record on one, and I would record my voice to one. And then I would rewind it and hit play on that and hit record on the second one, and play that back and record onto the second one while I sang something different, or I made hand claps or noises or whatever. And then I would repeat that process back and forth and bounce the music back and forth between these two. Well, inadvertently, I discovered multi-track recording, which is basically the foundation of all modern music right now. And so that was, again, there's that intersection between music and technology that was always interesting to me. All of that stuff just blew my mind as a kid. Something else that blew my mind as a kid, I'm going to wax nostalgic with you a little bit. 1988, the first season of Star Trek: The Next Generation, episode 17. The title was The Bow Breaks. And the Enterprise visits this planet called Aldea. And they go down to the planet and they visit the inhabitants of this planet, and they observe the inhabitants of this planet playing music. And the crew members say, what are you doing? And they're like, we're playing music. Well, how does it work? Oh, you just put your hands on this device, and you close your eyes, and you just think the music, and the music comes out. And as a kid, I was like, oh, I want that. Where do I get that? Where do I get that? And so that just blew my mind. That kind of thing was just like, oh, there's got to be a way to do that. Maybe not now, but there's got to be a way to do that. So that started my journey into searching for that intersection between technology and music. And so I started looking for music and looking for artists that were trying to do advanced things with music and technology. I discovered Peter Gabriel. I started listening to early hip-hop music. These artists were using this technology called sampling, and for those of you who don't understand what sampling is essentially recording sound into a digital audio device or a computer, not actually unlike what I was doing as a kid with the tape recorders. In fact, sampling actually goes back even earlier than that. If anybody's familiar with the Beatles' Strawberry Fields, you hear that sound of the flutes in there. Well, it's not real flutes, it's an instrument called a mellotron. And that mellotron is a device that has a tape loop for each key on the keyboard in which they recorded the sound of a flute playing chromatically. So that was like one of the earliest uses of sampling. And so I got interested in sampling and started looking for more artists. And unfortunately, these artists that were using sampling were just way ahead of the curve and must have had unlimited budgets, because that was just simply out of the reach of the consumer at that time. So I'd have to wait about 10 years before I got to the point where I could actually use sampling personally. So in the early 2000s, people started using sampling with the computer and with software, and then it became something where I could get into it. So I started making electronic music in the early 2000s. And about 5 or 6 years later, I wasn't content with just making music. I wanted to perform my music, but unfortunately, performing electronic music at the time could have been misconstrued as checking your email, because what are you going to use, a mouse or a trackpad? There were devices that you could use called MIDI devices, and MIDI is a protocol. It stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it was a protocol designed to hook up electronic instruments so that they could talk to each other and also talk to the computer. And so I discovered that there are different MIDI instruments that you could use to perform. Ones that were, chromatic, like a keyboard, and ones that had buttons and knobs and sliders and things like that. But I still wasn't content to play my music on a piano. I didn't want to play my music on a piano. I wanted something that I could do something myself, that I could just make it myself. And so eventually, some devices started coming out that were nondescript, that were grid controllers. They were basically just a series of buttons or a series of knobs, and they allowed you to do whatever, program them to do whatever you wanted to with them. And so I bought one of those, and I started experimenting with that, and that finally gave me a way to interact with my music the way I wanted to, not in a traditional sense like with a keyboard, but it still gave me this tactile, physical interaction with my music. So it wasn't quite the Star Trek level yet, but it was enough for me to really grab onto. And so I have a video that you can roll here and show you an example of what it looks like.
So I don't know how many of you remember Winamp, but I spent an inordinate amount of time in front of the computer in the 90s with MP3s loaded up, watching the visualizations happen. Most of the time it was Pink Floyd, Learning to Fly, all the time without drugs. I know, surprising a little bit, but yes. So in the conversation with Chris, we were talking about what we could do. We really wanted to make sure that we took his music and gave it some sort of visual appeal. And we knew we could do it with LCDs. We knew we could do it with the screens, because that's easy. That's something simple. But what we really came down to was this: an analog device, a human, into a digital device, which then creates digital music and then gives a feedback loop of analog light, hence illumination. We took this very literally when we started working on the illumination concept. So we started breaking down the ideas, thinking about what we could do, how we could make that actual step-by-step happen, which then led us to the launch pads, which I'll let Chris talk about right now.
So yeah, as we started just talking through some of the different technologies that we could potentially use to do this project, we decided to settle on using the Launchpad. And the Launchpad was the device I talked about earlier. And it's basically a grid of buttons that you can kind of program to do whatever you want to. I can program it to fire off light shows. I can use it to play music. I can use it to send keyboard commands, play videos. I can really command it to do whatever I like to do with it. What I've done, just to show you an example of something that I do, is with sampling. I record music into the computer, whether or not it's my music, or it might be found sounds, or it might be a record, or it might be a drum beat, and then I'm able to put it in the computer and manipulate it. So see if any of you guys recognize this song at all. Right? Pure imagination? Yes? It's Willy Wonka. Pure imagination from Willy Wonka. So then what I do is once I put it in the computer, then I can chop it up into pieces. So then it allows me to manipulate it in time and do things with it. So I'm going to give you a quick demo here. Dickie, I'm going to have you hold this.
This is my life.
Yeah. Since you're wearing the, actually I'm going to turn it this way. Since you're wearing the mechanical device, you can be my mechanical device.
Yes.
So. that's the Launchpad. So the Launchpad we found to be a really flexible device to be able to use for what we wanted to do with our installation, because you can not only have this physical interaction with music, but you also have the light feedback with it. And I discovered later that you could actually program it and send lights back to it without even having to interact with it. And so we thought, well, this might be the foundation of our project here. Let's talk about using this. And so I was able actually to make. I posted some example videos of us trying some different things, and I actually got the attention of the company Novation that actually makes these devices. And I contacted them. I said, hey, is there any way that we could borrow a couple of these devices to do this thing for the TEDx? And they're like, oh yeah, just let us know how many you want, and we'll send you whatever you want. And so. They graciously, shipped me out a bunch of them, and that's what we're using actually to put this whole project together. So, one of the really interesting things about this project is we sent a bunch of ideas back and forth, sketches, Facebook messages, trying to figure out what exactly we wanted to do. And I think whenever you're collaborating with somebody, you start off with a lot of abstract ideas, and you're trying to figure out, what's really possible. And as a designer, I work with this principle that I call the inverted triangle. You've got a triangle, it's inverted. You start off with all your abstract ideas, up here that are a little bit shady and not quite sure where you want to go. And then as you go and you start refining the process and you start distilling it down, you start throwing out the things that don't work, or finding out what the roadblocks are. It might be costs, or it might be size, or whatever. And eventually you get down to the point where you've got this idea that you think is doable and has a high amount of quality. And so it was really interesting. Actually, I think up until we've been talking about this since the beginning of the summer, but I was really only up until about 3 weeks ago that I really quite understood exactly what it was that we were doing. So it was it's been an interesting experience.
I mean, we talked about a TARDIS. But how do you make it bigger? We just no Time Lords are available. Disappointment.
Talked about mirror balls,
lasers. We had a projector flying up. So really what it comes down to is this. We started distilling the project. We started refining the project. We started figuring out how we could make this all happen. And that's part of the creative process. But the most important part of the creative process is sharing. And for those of you out there who are creative, and Vaughn's going to talk about being creative later on, if you're not sharing, you're not finishing. You haven't completed your project. If you're not getting it out there, you haven't done what you need to do with it. You can write, you can sing, you can create music, you can draw, but unless you're willing to share it with someone else, it hasn't been realized in its full value. And unfortunately, as Chris mentioned, the project was so big, so complex, that we just weren't able to complete it. It just was too much. And let me tell you the reason why. Because we needed you. We needed you in order to be able to share this project, in order to be able to get you involved with this idea. So we want to have you go upstairs and participate with us and help us complete this project. Thank you.